I want to add a content warning here. I will be mentioning acts of racial violence. This information is likely to be distressing for you. I will note when these acts take place so that you can skip that portion of the video. Alrighty, now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and get on to the video. What was then called the Tennessee Militia, what we would call today the Tennessee National Guard, was sent to protect the property, coal mines specifically, of the Tennessee Coal Iron and Railway Company, or the TCI, on behalf of the state from striking miners. Celebrated military officer Colonel Sevier was already hardened by battle, having recently sustained a gunshot wound to the stomach, of which he had clearly survived. Colonel Sevier went to the miners' camp alone, possibly without any directive to do so, in a diplomatic mission to establish peace between the striking, but sometimes militant miners, and their employer, the TCI. As he entered the camp, the colonel was surprised to be greeted by the sound of a revolver's chamber, spinning and then clicking once the bullet was ready to be released from the barrel. He could easily hear the internal mechanisms of the revolver getting ready to fire, as it was placed only a few inches away from his face. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, who was brave enough to approach an officer of the state militia, gun in hand, threatening to shoot? The brave man, who looked Colonel Sevier directly in the eyes, was none other than the black man known only as Woody. Woody was on a mission to free his fellow worker from the gruesome and unfair treatment by both the TCI and the state. If it wasn't for the fact that Woody was prevented from firing on Sevier by his co-conspirators, some young white men of the mines, the colonel would never have made it out alive to issue a threat once he himself returned to the militia's camp. Sevier spoke to the media, warning that if any of his men spotted Woody, they were ordered to shoot on sight. No trial. So basically, they were ordered to extrajudiciously kill someone in the name of justice on behalf of not only the state, but also the TCI. This order was in clear violation of the U.S. Constitution, in where the Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to a trial jury and to know and see the evidence of the crimes in which one has been accused. Now, when Woody came face to face with Sevier, it was 1892, and the system of chattel slavery had ended some 30 years prior. So Woody should have been afforded the right to stand trial for his perceived crimes against the state. But that didn't matter to many of the southern states, including my home state of Tennessee, where black people were still classified as second-class citizens. Thus, it was ordinary for Colonel Sevier to announce to the public his order to kill Woody on sight, and, per the Times, he received no condemnation by the public for this order. But what exactly were Woody's crimes? Well, that's what I want to explore with you today. Hi, my name is Misabled, and welcome to my channel. Let's discuss Woody and some other notable figures as we go through the events of what is known as the Coal Creek War or the Tennessee Convict War. This was a war for freedom and fair wages that pitted a then unprecedented multiracial coalition of miners and freedmen against both the corporate Tennessee Coal Iron and Railway Company and the state of Tennessee. It was the year 1891, and on the western side of the United States, the labor union known as the Knights of Labor were fighting to the death African Americans just for the jobs they believed belonged to white men only. So imagine, if you will, well, maybe don't. Imagine this, trying to kill somebody so that you can fill their place at, I don't know, Starbucks or something. But admittedly, the times were different, and without any social programs to which to turn, having a job was often a matter of life or death, even more so than it is today. The type of infighting that was taking place in the western U.S. was approved by, if not caused by, the wealthy for the purpose of maintaining the system of capitalism, which was really kind of coming into its own during the Industrial Revolution, and especially during this time. The system of capitalism, much like it does today, largely benefited the wealthy. So all I'm saying here is that these wealthy individuals really had an invested interest in maintaining capitalism, and most likely had some hand in creating the hostility felt between the supposed lower classes. The hostility was centered largely around race and ethnicity. So, in the western United States, Knights of Labor were fighting their fellow workers, but things played out differently for the Knights in the eastern portion of the U.S. Like the heavy involvement of race that was seen in the West, the story I'm about to tell you involving the Knights of Labor in the eastern U.S. too involves one of the most egregious legalized activities that took place in America, the act of slavery. Now, I recognize that America is a continent, but generally when I'm speaking about America, I am referring only to the United States. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution kind of abolished slavery. Now, there's a stipulation included in the 13th, in where those who are convicted of some crime can essentially be enslaved. This stipulation has yet to be removed, and it has been used to justify prison labor for over 100 years. Now, the 13th included the slavery stipulation in order to appease the Southern Confederate states after the Confederates lost the war. These states essentially were given a loophole that made the enslavement of people still possible. By the way, if you're wondering as to why such a high percentage of African Americans are in prison today, you have your answer in the form of an intentional loophole that was added to the U.S. Constitution in order to appease the Confederate states. This dynamic was born out of slavery and began with the addition of the 13th Amendment. It's also appalling that the Union ended up essentially kowtowing to the losers who should have been treated as traitors to the United States. But when has that ever caused anybody in favor of racist policies to ever get penalized for their actions, i.e. look to the events of January 6, 2021, for a reference there of a modern situation in which that was the case. Anyways, following the Civil War, Southern states used the exception loophole in the 13th to reintroduce and then reinforce the enslavement of African Americans. I will be doing a separate video on convict leasing and chain gangs, but what's important to understand here is that all labor conducted by those who were incarcerated was unpaid. And it should probably surprise nobody when I tell you that it was African Americans who were the ones largely confined to this type of free labor. They were the ones who found themselves imprisoned, often for the most absurd reasons that were conveniently codified into laws. For example, statutes like the vagrancy statute made it a crime to be unemployed, which was the condition many Black Americans found themselves in once they were no longer forced to labor for free, as many white Americans were unwilling to pay for labor that they considered to be slave labor. My source mentions that the convict leasing programs were filled with racially motivated violence that resulted in one of the most harshest and most exploitative labor systems known in American history. And it very well could have been one of the worst, possibly only second to the system of chattel slavery, where Black people were generational property objects made to labor in the servitude of white people. Either way, convict leasing programs were a way to maintain the social order, in which whites reigned supreme and continued to profit off of free labor. As one of my sources states, the convict lease system was not merely a replacement for slavery, but an extension of it, albeit in a new form and serving new interests. And in 1866, less than 12 months after the supposed end of chattel slavery, this program was enacted in Tennessee. In the 1870s, Tennessee's convict leasing program was expanded. This expansion included the leasing of labor by the prisons to mining and railway companies. It is not an exaggeration to say that in Tennessee, the criminal justice system was highly motivated to imprison African Americans. One of my sources mentions that, in Tennessee, African Americans represented 33% of the population at the main prison in Nashville as of October 1st, 1865. But by November 1867, their percentage had increased to 58.3%. By 1869, it had increased to 64%, reaching an all-time high of 67% between 1877 and 1879. So here we went from 33% to 67% in a little over a decade. Regarding the mines, nearly 3/4 of convict laborers were Black, so 75%. Here we have a system specifically designed to target Black Americans in order to force them to labor for free. It was in 1871 when coal mining companies started using the convict leasing program offered by the state. By 1884, the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railway Company had leased the entire prison, giving them total control over the convicts. I hope you've come to understand that it wasn't just the state that profited from this form of enslavement. Private companies worked hand in hand with the state to generate profits from convict leasing. Additional ways in which convict leasing would be used was to break strikes and to reduce and eliminate bargaining with labor unions. As one of my sources states, A.S. Collier of the TCI revealed one of the chief reasons which induced the company to take up the system was the great change it offered in overcoming strikes. convicts. I don't mind saying that for many years, the company found this an effective club to be held over the heads of the free laborers. This was the setup that led to the events that would take someone like Woody from simple laborer to, from the perspective of the state of Tennessee, notorious criminal. The TCI used convict labor at and around the Coal Creek area in Anderson County to force free laborers of the mines into compliance. But into compliance they did not go. Throughout 1891 and 1892, free miners, known to be members of the Knights of Labor, along with supporters of their cause, armed themselves against their former bosses. These men dismantled and burned down convict cells the company built near the mines. They went on to relinquish the convicts of their duties at various times throughout the mines of Anderson County. At first, these free workers released the convicts by essentially sending the convicts back to the prisons. As this was only proving to be a simple annoyance to the state and the TCI, who then sent the prisoners right back to the mines, the free workers released the convicts without sending them back to the prisons. They gave them clothes to replace their soiled rags and sent them off with some pocket money and some food. There are accounts of free laborers, as they released the convicts to go anywhere they pleased, warning the newly freed men to stay out of trouble. Historians debate whether or not the freeing of the convicts were due to class solidarity or due to the desire for personal economic gains. I believe that it's probably a bit of both here. It can easily be economically beneficial for one to do the morally right thing and find solidarity with someone and release them from bondage. There's a decent amount of evidence that primarily comes from the arrest records of the combatants. And this evidence points to some morally upstanding individuals that were just in it to do the right thing. My source goes on to mention that while the Union miners and their leadership were made up primarily of white men, black miners were active participants of the movement who gained the respect and solidarity of their comrades. After having exhausted all legal means to gain labor protections and abolish convict leasing, 150 free miners surrounded a prison labor camp on one August night in 1892. Since the soldiers guarding the camp realized that they were outmatched and outnumbered, they instantly surrendered the camp. While no physical violence occurred that night, the free miners were armed and ready to fight. Having taken control of the camp, the free miners went about releasing the convicts. As my source notes, moving quickly throughout the camp, the miners freed hundreds of convicts, dispatching them on trains across Tennessee where they could evade law enforcement. This incident was recorded by news agency of the era in very racialized terms. As the Chattanooga Daily Times wrote, the Negroes were happy and begged money. The white men looked surly and said nothing. The way in which this is framed made it appear as if the white men who participated in that raid were inactive participants in their own actions, while the convicts, the majority of whom were black, were essentially dumb and helpless, and, by being released, would result in draining the resources of white men, a very persistent stereotype of the times. Aspects of that stereotype are still used even today. Regardless of its framing, the newly freed men approved of their newfound freedom. In relation to these convicts, my source writes, they celebrated with rebellious jubilation, with music and song, with tobacco and laughter. In this way, even if they weren't organizing with the Knights of Labor, the men, freed in these battles, were able to express emotions that emphasized their own autonomy and revolution. Their dreams of freedom come true. The truth of the matter is that black men did appear to be allying with the Knights, whether they were members or not. While the papers attempted to make it appear as if the white men were less combatant and less of an ally, the same papers often contradicted this assertion. The same Chattanooga Daily recorded the names of some of the leaders of the rebellion, 4 of whom were black men, the majority of them being members of the Knights. The exception was Ora Jones. He was a former convict himself, and so had first-hand experience of the gruesome treatment they endured under the convict leasing program. The 3 other black leaders of the rebellion were most likely members of the Knights, or in extremely close proximity to the Knights. These men were John Maxwell, Sam Payne, and A.L. Spring. While these 4 were notable leaders of the rebellion, the Times mentioned that a sizable number of black men were among those who rioted with the white men, mentioning that they assisted these men during the peaceful seizure of the camp and the subsequent release of the convicts. After winning this battle, the miners celebrated, but the air of celebration among the rebels weren't to last, as a horrific murder took place the very next day at a party in Briceville. They laughed, they drank alcohol, and they danced. But it wasn't too long before the party was interrupted. A local militia officer, Lieutenant Perry Fife, upon hearing the music, seeing the dancing, and witnessing the laughter, wanted to join in on the festivities for some reason. However, the miners weren't cool with this, and so they attempted to deny him entry. Fife ended up bursting through the party-goers and made his way inside. At some point, he got into a fight with one of the miners. A physical fight broke out in which Fife was very clearly on the losing side of the altercation. I think he was embarrassed by having gotten his ass kicked or something. He probably thought that his honor was in jeopardy. I am making a video on this type of belief, the Southern tradition of honor as it relates to violence. So stay tuned for that. And it's at this point in the video where I start talking about racial violence. If you want to skip this portion of the video, and I wouldn't blame you, go ahead and jump to 17 minutes and 30 seconds. Anyways, after the fight, Fife left. But then he returned with some other militia members as backup for what he was about to do. These reinforcement soldiers busted into the celebration themselves and located the young man who fought with Fife. They ended up dragging him out of the party and promptly lynching him from a nearby tree. It is said that the young man was more akin to a teenager, and that his name was Drummond. There's actually no mention of Drummond's race, but it's suspected by historians that he was most likely black. And this assumption is based on the way in which they horrifically executed him, because in the South, it was customary to initiate duels for those who were near the same status as oneself. Generally speaking, lynchings were primarily reserved for black people. Drummond was said to be a member of the Knights of Labor, and it shouldn't really be up for debate whether or not black people were included in the ranks of the Knights. Eastern American Knights of Labor not only accepted black members into their ranks, but they also went out on campaigns to actively recruit black laborers. They also accepted women laborers into their union, and this, at the time, was essentially unheard of. It defied rules of other unions in which black people and women were banned from joining their ranks. Anyhow, the next few days following the murder of Drummond, Union miners and their allies battled with the state's militia. These battles were violent and resulted in a few deaths of both militiamen and miners, and unfortunately straight-up executions of those on the miners' side of the battle. However, the white miners were not executed. Instead, they were captured and then ended up in court for a trial. If I may, Tennessee, speaking to you, this is downright shameful. But do you want to know another thing that's worth condemnation and shame? So, I grew up in Tennessee. All of us in school had to take Tennessee history pretty much every year from 3rd grade to 10th grade or so. So I want to know, Tennessee, why were the events of the Cold War never mentioned during any of those years I took Tennessee history? I didn't learn this in the place where it made the most sense to be told about these events. Instead, someone told me about it and I looked it up like a few months ago. A tragic result from the Cold Creek War is that, as my source puts it, without a trial to defend themselves, black men and women were often left nameless, only identified by the crimes and the legacies of history. The Cold Creek War left many black men to suffer similar fates, with their names only known to their comrades and loved ones. Now, this is why I've been mostly focusing on the stories of black men who were named as I go through the history of the Cold Creek War. Black men like Henry Whitson, who was considered to be a large threat by the state. He was spotted and immediately shot dead. Whitson was known and was feared by the establishment. Papers mentioned Whitson by name, which was unusual considering his status as a second-class citizen. He was characterized by the papers as a notorious colored desperado, cutthroat, and miner. My source points out that Henry Whitson, his status as an ex-con and a miner, revealed the ways in which black combatants in the Cold Creek War fought on both the fronts of economic and racial justice. An additional black man who was essentially archived by the papers due to his involvement as one of the rebels of the Cold Creek War is Woody, the man I mentioned at the beginning of the video. So clearly Woody was notable, so much so that he was not only mentioned by the papers, but also had a celebrated colonel of the Tennessee militia publicly call for his immediate execution if cited. Without going into the Southern culture of honor, my sense is that the colonel here developed a vendetta against Woody. After all, the interaction between Woody and the colonel the one that I mentioned at the beginning of the story, wasn't the only time Woody and Severe had encountered each other. No, my friends. Prior to the revolver incident, Woody was involved in a sabotage mission against the militia. Now, this mission involved Woody and another man, Bud Lindsay, who was white. It is said that both Lindsay and Woody were senior-ranking members of the rebellion. Bud Lindsay just so happened to be the most sought-after convict in the state of Tennessee. Interestingly, though, while the papers did not directly note the high-ranking status of Woody, both Woody and Lindsay were considered to be top priority targets by the state. So Lindsay and Woody did this mission of sabotage together. They spotted a militia group near Coal Creek and convinced them that they, both Lindsay and Woody, were sent by the state to prepare some wires for the camp. The militiamen believed them and left Woody and Lindsay to their own devices so that the two rebels could complete their task in fixing up those wires. But they didn't fix them. Instead, they pulled out wires, cut wires, did everything possible to destroy whatever was so important about those wires. In the process of doing this, they kept looking up from their task to monitor the state of the camp. Apparently, when they glanced time to time at the camp, they looked a bit panicked. At some point, Colonel Severe noticed them and their odd behavior. Before Severe could monitor the two more closely, Woody and Lindsay were satisfied with their destruction work and ran off to a handcar. Now, I had to look up what a handcar was, and it's that pump car that you see on train tracks, usually in cartoons, and it operates by using a seesaw mechanism in the middle of the two people standing on opposing sides pushing the hand pump up and down so that the thing moves. Hopefully that gives you a clear description. Probably doesn't, but anyways. In their panic, they ran to this handcar, but were intercepted by some militiamen who were guarding the train tracks. They get captured, but both men put up a fight. Woody ended up escaping, but Lindsay was captured. Now, it is said that a pact between Woody and Lindsay was formed prior to their capture, in which they both decided that if they were ever to get captured, Lindsay would sacrifice himself in order for Woody to escape. It is here my source suggests that Lindsay sacrificing his own freedom and preserving Woody's suggests not only a mutual respect and trust between the two, but also an acknowledgement from Lindsay that Woody was an important figure for the rebellion, and that his escape would be beneficial for the cause. It is also notable here that it is likely that had Woody gotten captured, he would have been immediately executed, whereas Lindsay knew that as a white man, he had more of a chance to not suffer the same fate. And so even then, there's definitely a priority for life preservation, which means that there's some respect between the two men and some acknowledgement of the different privileges that the two men are afforded in society. Many reports at the time about the incident erased Woody as an important figure to the miners' cause altogether, referring to Woody simply as Lindsay's associate. It was Woody's second encounter with Severe that caused the papers of the Times to actually mention him by at least his first name or his nickname. What the papers avoided mentioning the most was Woody's importance in the rebellion and the respect the miners had for Woody. As my source says, all evidence points to the fact that Woody was a high-ranking and essential figure among the miners in the Coal Creek War, whose actions managed to overcome his erasure. But it's also important to see that Woody wasn't an exception in this war. Many black men who were never archived were crucial members of the rebellion and were members of the Knights of Labor. So, what happened to Woody, and how did the Coal Creek War end? Well, the war wasn't an immediate success upon the complete surrender by the men of the mines and their allies. As stated, the miners had exhausted every legal way possible that would end the convict leasing system, which was essentially what the war was about. At some point during the hostilities, the governor called for a special session of the legislature to decide the fate of the convict leasing program. But instead of ending the program, they made it illegal for anyone to interfere with the convict leasing system. Now that is a very right-wing response if I've ever seen one. As a result, the miners were unable to win the legal and peaceful way, and so they resorted to violence. But the various men fighting for economic and racial justice were ultimately defeated by the invisible hand of the TCI wielding the state. By the end of August 1892, the state had arrested hundreds of free miners. The final notable act conducted by the miners occurred in April of 1893, when hundreds of miners attacked a stockade in Tracy City, Tennessee, but the miners lost the battle that day, and ultimately lost the war against the TCI. While the TCI continued to sabotage labor at every turn, bringing miners' wages down further and overworking them to the point of total exhaustion, It can be argued that the miners won the war against the state. In the next convening of the Tennessee legislature, the representatives, which I understand were called something else, but they were essentially the representatives. So the representatives here moved to end the state's convict leasing system. The bill to end the system narrowly passed, and it was a bill of compromise. While the leasing program would come to an end, the bill assured that no new contracts could be made, and that existing contracts could continue the use of convict labor until the contracts expired. So, by law, the convict leasing contracts could not be renewed. So while the leasing program was abolished by the State Assembly in 1883, it wasn't until 1896 when the lease of the convicts by the TCI expired. So, from 1866 to 1896, Tennessee leased out for the state's coffers Black Tennesseans to private corporations to conduct manual labor under grueling and cruel conditions. This arrangement aided these corporations in busting existing unions and punishing labor strikes, while providing some funds to the state. More importantly, for the state, the program helped maintain the social hierarchy that was well established under the chattel slavery system. As for Woody, there's no mention of his capture and/or execution. What is known is that Woody continued to strike fear in the hearts of the men of the state militia. Time and time again, officials called for Woody's head, but time and time again, that call would go unanswered, and then he simply faded into obscurity with the help of intentional erasure and time. Upon reflection, I can't help but notice that the power and resultant problems of capitalism haven't changed, because it's been working just as it was always designed. Remember when earlier on I mentioned how capitalism was in full swing by the time the events of the Cold Creek War took place? The interrelationship between the TCI and the state of Tennessee was necessary under the economic system of capitalism, a system that benefits those at the peak of the social hierarchy. Those at the top use their accumulated wealth to influence governments, so they can accumulate even more wealth in order to influence more governmental policies that work for them. The state aided the wealthy owners of the TCI in a variety of ways, but the two most blatant ways it did so was by protecting the private property of the mine owners, using the state militia to capture and/or assassinate free laborers and supporters of their cause, and by allowing the TCI to use convicts as slave labor. So cheap to free labor ended up having a twofold effect for the TCI. First, it substantially reduced labor costs, so more money for those at the top of the capitalists' pyramid. Second, it diminished the bargaining power of workers, as they were always under threat of being replaced if they didn't accept whatever low wage they were given, or the terms of their working conditions. Terms that maintain the balance of power in favor of those who own the mines. Capitalism needs the state to enforce that power dynamic, as the state has a monopoly on the use of violence. It's considered criminal, punishable by death in many states like in Tennessee, for anyone to use violence against another if they aren't supported by the state to enact that violence. So basically, if they aren't cops or military, like Lieutenant Perry Fife. Fife never was held accountable for murdering Drummond. He was allowed to live a full life and a quote-unquote honorable military career. He served the state, and in serving the state, he served the capitalists, just as was expected of him. Today, it's less common for the military to enforce the status quo within the United States. That job has been transferred to the police. Capitalism requires a hierarchy to function. In the U.S., as was the case during the events of the Cold Creek War, that hierarchy is more easily constructed by race and ethnicity. It's a visual identifier that assures the continual existence of a lower class, as white workers, unlike the workers involved in the Cold Creek War, tended to ally with the white aristocracy.
You start out in 1954 by saying no. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites,
as opposed to finding class solidarity across racial lines, despite probably having more in common with black workers. Those at the top profit from the labor of those at the bottom. Thus, poverty and the poor will always exist under capitalism. Simply put, there has to be a lower class for there to be an upper class. As poverty and debt and a continued life of servitude based on something like race becomes too much to bear, uprisings are more likely to occur. The police, through state-sanctioned violence, help stop those uprisings before they start. They not only place the labor force into compliance, they also protect the private property of the owners. This past summer, in 2020, large-scale protests occurred all over the country when George Floyd was assassinated by a cop. Yes, property damage occurred, as does a common narrative espoused by the media and government officials alike. They say something like, what about the property? We gotta protect the property. And then when property damage actually does occur, I end up hearing something like, look at them. Them meaning Black people. They're destroying their own property. Now, these talking heads said such comments in order to justify police brutality against the protesters, and also to minimize their grievances. Now, something someone said always struck with me. There was a Black woman, and she was being interviewed, and there was mention of property damage having occurred, to which she says something to the effect of, this might be where we live, but we don't own anything. And in that statement, she said everything you need to know about how capitalism continues to work just as designed. Owners need workers, and under the threat of violence, workers are forced into compliance by the state for the capitalist. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, go ahead and give the video a like. Check out some of my other videos, and subscribe to the channel while you're here. I hope you have a very good day. This was a long one. I'm gonna go take a nap. See you guys after my nap at some point. Bye!